Hello, everyone. My name is Garvin, and I talk about all sorts of topics apparently on the internet. Today, we're going to talk about a plot that occurs in just about every mythology I've looked into and is still in use in some stories and belief systems across the globe: kidnapping. Now, fair warning, folks, this is going to cover some rather upsetting topics like violence towards women and children, sexual assault, and various other things that are likely to disturb people. If this is something that is going to deeply upset you, please feel free to give this video a skip, maybe look at some of my other videos instead, or even just come back later. I'd rather you took care of yourself out there, alright? Kidnapping is a universal fear, which helps explain its widespread appearance in myth and folklore. For example, a common nightmare parents can have is not being able to find their children and be left wandering about their home or in a public place, fruitlessly searching for them. Another fear is losing a loved one to outside forces and not having any idea what their ultimate fate is, or even being kidnapped yourself and becoming the prisoner of strange people with likely hostile goals for you. Now, hopefully, most of you out there will never have to realistically fear that or experience that loss. But even in today's world, people have to fear having their children, adult loved ones, or even themselves taken away by force. I'm not going to touch too much on the real world in this video, though, because that's a really complex and complicated topic, and I'm just not sure I could do it justice. So we're going to focus on mythology and folklore instead. Who tends to do the kidnapping in myths and stories, you might ask? If you're guessing Zeus, in a lot of cases you would be right, but I meant in a more general sense. Now, even in most Iron and Bronze Age myths, the kidnapper tends to be an antagonist in the story, not the protagonist or the hero. What's interesting here, in some mythologies, we'll have the protagonist of other stories show up as an antagonist because they're kidnapping someone. The kidnapper also tends to be someone with power, whether that's supernatural, political, economic, or military power, or even some combination of the above, varies on the story. This means you have a wide variety of enemies to choose from: gods, demons, wizards, kings, landlords, monsters, soldiers, criminals, and more, all engaging in this terrible behavior. Now, there are times when the kidnapper is the protagonist, but outside of romantic or erotic fiction, where there are often different rules at play, these kidnappings either start or turn consensual fairly fast. That, or the kidnapper repents of their misdeeds and frees their victim, realizing they had no right to do this in the first place. Another trend is that you'll have a protagonist kidnapper that isn't kidnapping someone out of their own desires, but because someone else is making them do it, either through duty or through force or just plain blackmail. These stories tend to happen in more modern contexts or in folklore, but can also include revised versions of old stories, which isn't uncommon since mythologies and folklores aren't static or frozen, but are living, changing things that reflect the beliefs and values of the people telling the story in question. Who gets kidnapped, though? In the vast majority of stories I was able to find, the victims are generally women and children. Now, there are stories where full grown men get kidnapped, often by goddesses or supernatural monsters, although they are kidnapped by powerful women as well. But in the large majority of cases, it's adult women and children of any gender who get targeted. The women who are kidnapped are usually women of unusual beauty, and often they are women who are either wealthy or politically powerful as well, or connected to people who are. This makes princesses the most favored targeted group among women, although you also see queens, noble women, wealthy heiresses, or sometimes just well favored women who are considered both beautiful and virtuous. The kidnapping is usually carried out by some underhanded method involving trickery or deceit. There can also be an element of betrayal involved, as the kidnapper isn't always a stranger. When there's a supernatural element, the kidnapper will often but not always, use some form of illusion or shapeshifting to lull their victim and their guardians into a false sense of security. Additional magic may be used to affect the getaway as well, either by putting people to sleep or into a trance, or creating a distraction, or even just grabbing the victim and flying away. Literally. When there's not a supernatural element involved, the kidnapper will usually violate some sort of social taboo or use a different method of deceit or disguise. Other times, the kidnapper will use blackmail or threats against the victim's loved ones. There are examples of main force being used, but strangely, those are in a minority. My guess is that helps paint the kidnapper as in the wrong, as they can only achieve their goals by using methods that society doesn't approve of. So, why are people kidnapped? In most stories, the whole point of the kidnapping is to possess the person being kidnapped. It's rarely a situation where you're kidnapping someone for ransom, especially when the victim is an adult. So, often the motivation is physical lust and not caring what anybody else has to say about it, including the target of their desires, which doesn't say anything good about the kidnapper, in my opinion. The kidnapping can also be about humiliating the loved ones of the victim. In such cases, the victim is only valuable to the kidnapper because of their relationship to the kidnapper's real target, which is usually the protagonist. In a lot of societies, your value or status depended on your ability to protect the people you cared about or were considered responsible for. If someone kidnapped your betrothed or spouse, for example, and you either couldn't or didn't do anything to get them back, well, people would see that as a sign of weakness. If you were a ruler or a leader, being seen as weak is never a good idea in this environment. Now, with children, there are times when the kidnapping is meant to compel the parents of the victim to do something, or to simply punish them for something the parents or the child did. That said, even if the target is a child, there are times that the kidnapping happened because the kidnapper wants the child, either to raise as their own, to enslave for labor, or for other darker and more terrifying reasons. There's an entire class of monsters out there who kidnap children for an easy meal, for example. In most cases, the kidnapping is done by some sort of supernatural creature, though. Enslavement can also be used as a reason to kidnap adults, but doesn't come up as often in myth and folklore unless it's the mass taking of an entire group, which I honestly think should be placed in its own category, so we're not going to discuss it today. In most stories, the kidnapping is not the story itself, however. It's the inciting incident or an escalation in a pre existing conflict. The story itself then turns into a rescue. This rescue can take a lot of forms, but they tend to boil down into two broad categories: the quest or the war. You can find plenty of both in old mythology, folklore, and modern day stories, although stories set in the modern day are less likely to have war as a response to a kidnapping. Those do exist, though, especially in crime stories or urban fantasy where you can fight a war and no one notices because of magic. I should note, though, that even in fairy tales, not every kidnapping story turns into a rescue. The quest is when our protagonist either sets out to rescue the victim alone or with a small group of friends and allies. That can often mean that they will meet obstacles and additional enemies on the way to save the victim, but these can be opportunities to acquire additional resources, like hidden knowledge, more allies, or weapons before the final confrontation. In a lot of quests, a big part of the quest is figuring out who the kidnapper is and where they took your loved one in the first place. Now, a brute force physical confrontation with the kidnapper is possible as the climax to this story, but just as often the protagonist relies on stealth or other means to effect a rescue. This can be as simple as sneaking in and out of the enemy stronghold or openly challenging your enemy to a riddle or song contest. Often, the quest is undertaken when the antagonist is much more powerful than our plucky protagonist, which is why an open confrontation solved by force may not be on the table. In such cases, the quest may lead to a chase, where the protagonist, having completed the rescue, now has to flee with their loved one and escape the chasing antagonist. This is where the climax actually happens, and often as not, is where the kidnapping victim gets a measure of revenge, either by directly or indirectly being the instrument of the antagonist's doom. Now, the protagonists in these stories are usually of humble origin or are currently out of power, which is why they can't turn to the war solution. Although sometimes you will have a quest turn into a war if the protagonist earns enough allies and weapons to change the balance of power. The war is when an army or other such large force is gathered and meets a comparatively powerful force in open conflict. This can be a supernatural fight or a straightforward military slugfest, or some combination of the two. At this point, you can have a wide variety of characters involved, and there's often a host of sub stories and supporting stories attached to this. This also lets you have sympathetic characters on the side of the antagonist, as well as having unsympathetic characters on the side of protagonist, as wars attract unsavory people. As opposed to the quest, where sympathetic characters are most likely all going to end up on the protagonist's side by the end, this is a lot less likely in war. An additional difference is that the war is much more likely to have a large number of characters dead at the end of it. After all, if there's one constant in war, it's that people die. As often as not, sympathetic characters are turned into so much mulch to show the tragedy of a conflict caused by one person's bad decision. We should take a moment to remember poor Hector here. Rest in peace. This is where the war can also turn into a quest, due to the protagonist realizing that the war is either too destructive, or is going to take too long, or even runs the risk of killing the very person they want to save. At that point, the protagonist takes it on themselves to find a more direct way of bringing this issue to a hopefully happy ending. Even when the victim is rescued, however, there can be lingering issues, and some kidnapping stories have rather lengthy sequels. These sequels can be about everything from, oh, how do we get home, to rebuilding and mending relationships, or dealing with people who are upset that you took out the antagonist. Remember, just because someone is an awful person doesn't mean they can't have loved ones who took offense to that person's death or punishment. Other stories don't turn into rescues, but have the victim dealing with their fate, and those can get pretty dark or questionable. That said, there are entire romance subgenres that turn around those story elements, so there's an audience. I've been speaking in pretty general terms, and we're still running long here. So I hate to do this, especially after the Greek colonization event, but yeah, we're going to have to do at least, most likely, two more kidnapping videos. So join me next week, folks, where I will expand on this further and give examples, mostly delving further into the differences between the various types of kidnappers and see where we go from there. That said, I hope you found the video interesting and informative. If you did, please leave a like or a comment, as that really helps me in the battle against the Dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. Also, feel free to subscribe and ring that bell. If you really like this video, consider joining the Patreon, where my ever-wise patrons get to vote on upcoming content. There are several polls up right now, and you get a vote for as little as $1 a month. Speaking of patrons, a special thanks to my biggest supporter, Big Steve. As always, man, thank you. Until next week, folks, stay safe, keep reading.